the big space station called Nexus. Prime floated between two bright stars in the Kepler system, and Commander Jake Morrison walked through its long metal halls toward the main meeting room where all the alien races would gather today for something. They called a cultural exchange meeting, and he felt nervous because humans had only been part of this galactic group for 5 years, which was nothing compared to how long the other species had been traveling between stars and making deals with each other. The meeting room was huge, with walls made of some kind of crystal that showed the colors of distant space clouds, and there were seats arranged in a big circle for all the different alien species, and Jake sat down at the human table, next to Ambassador Lisa Grant, who was the main human speaker for these meetings, and Dr. Ben Carter, who knew more about human history and old stories than anyone else Jake had ever met. All around them sat the aliens, and Jake still felt amazed every time he saw them because they looked so different from humans, and the Zephyrians looked like they were made of living crystal that changed colors when they moved, and the Vorthan Empire people were tall and covered in metal skin that reflected the lights, and the Cathara looked like giant insects with too many arms and eyes that never seemed to blink. And there were dozens of other species all sitting and waiting for the meeting to start. The meeting leader was a Zephyrian whose crystal body glowed blue and green, and it spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes when it said that today each species would share their greatest legends and mythological heroes so that all the races could learn about each other and understand their cultures better. And Jake thought this sounded like a good idea because humans had many great stories to tell. The Zephyrians went first and told stories about crystal warriors who could change the shape of rocks and metal just by thinking about it, and these warriors had built great cities that floated in space without any machines to hold them up, and everyone listened with respect and made approving sounds when the story was finished. Then the Vorthan Empire told about their void-walking ancestors who could walk through black holes like they were doorways and travel to other galaxies in just a few steps, and these ancestors had conquered entire star systems and built an empire that lasted for millions of years. And again, all the aliens listened with great interest and respect. More species told their stories, and Jake noticed that all of them were about beings with incredible powers that no normal person could ever have, and they spoke about controlling time and space and matter and energy like these things were just tools that anyone could use. And Jake started to feel worried about what would happen when it was time for humans to tell their stories. When Dr. Carter stood up to speak for humanity, Jake held his breath and hoped for the best, and Dr. Carter began telling the story of Hercules and his 12 great tasks, and how he was the strongest man who ever lived and could lift mountains and fight monsters that no one else could defeat. And as he spoke, Jake heard soft sounds coming from the alien tables. The Cathara were making clicking noises with their mouths that sounded like laughing, and the Sorok reptile people were hissing in a way that definitely meant they thought something was funny, and even the Zephyrians were changing colors and patterns that Jake had learned meant they were amused by something they considered silly. Dr. Carter continued with stories about King Arthur and his magic sword, and the knights who sat at a round table and fought evil with honor and courage, and about Robin Hood who stole from rich people to help poor people. And the alien sounds got louder, and Jake could hear whispers in different alien languages that he did not understand, but the tone made it clear they were not impressed. When Dr. Carter told about Paul Bunyan, the giant lumberjack who could cut down entire forests with his huge axe and dig rivers with his bare hands, the Vorthan delegate actually laughed out loud and said something about primitive strength myths and how cute it was that humans still believed in such simple stories. The Zephyrian ambassador spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear when it said that humans were clearly still in the early stages of development. If their heroes were just strong people who could lift heavy things and fight with metal weapons like barbarians from the ancient past, Jake felt his face get hot with anger and embarrassment as more aliens joined in making comments about how basic and unsophisticated human legends were compared to their own stories of cosmic powers and reality-bending abilities, and he wanted to stand up and defend his species. But Ambassador Grant put her hand on his arm to keep him from causing trouble. Meeting ended with polite clapping for all the other species, but when Dr. Carter finished telling human stories, The room was mostly quiet except for some aliens still whispering, and Jake could tell they thought humans were just primitive creatures who told childish stories about people doing impossible things with nothing but muscles and simple tools. As everyone left the meeting room, Jake heard more comments about the naive young species and their silly stories about strongmen and sword fighters, and he felt angry that these aliens looked down on humanity just because their legends were different, and he wondered if humans would ever be accepted as equals in this galactic community, or if they would always be seen as the backwards newcomers who did not understand how the universe really worked. The next morning, Jake Morrison woke up in his small quarters on the space station to the sound of emergency alarms ringing through the metal walls and red lights flashing in the hallways, and he quickly put on his uniform and ran toward the main command center, where he found Ambassador Grant and dozens of alien officials all talking at once in worried voices about something terrible that had happened. A Kithara science ship called the Research Wing had been studying a pulsar, which was a kind of dead star that spins very fast and shoots out dangerous radiation beams, and something had gone wrong with their engines while they were too close to the pulsar, and now they were trapped in its electromagnetic field with no way to escape, and the ship carried 300 Kithara scientists who would die if they were not rescued soon. The Galactic Council emergency meeting was chaos, with representatives from every species shouting suggestions and arguing about what could be done. But every idea seemed to have problems that made it impossible, and Jake listened as the Zephyrians explained that their crystal ships would break apart if they got too close to the pulsar, because the electromagnetic fields would make the crystals vibrate until they shattered into pieces. The Vorthan Empire delegates said their void-walking technology could not work near a pulsar because the intense radiation would interfere with their ability to open doorways through space, and without their special traveling powers, their ships were not fast enough or strong enough to reach the trapped vessel before everyone on board died from radiation poisoning. The Kithara's own rescue ships could not get through the electromagnetic field without having all their electronic systems destroyed by the energy pulses, and even if they could reach their people, they had no way to pull the research wing out of the pulsar's grip, because their engines were not powerful enough to break free from such a strong gravitational and electromagnetic field. Other species offered their help, but every advanced technology had the same problem, and the electromagnetic radiation from the pulsar would destroy any computer systems or delicate machinery. And the gravitational field was so strong that only the most powerful engines could hope to escape from it, and even then the radiation would probably kill anyone who got close enough to help. Jake watched the alien leaders argue and blame each other and make excuses for why their superior technology could not solve this problem, and he felt frustrated because these same beings had laughed at human legends just yesterday and called humans primitive, but now their advanced science was useless when real people needed help. Ambassador Grant stood up quietly in the middle of all the shouting and said in her calm voice that perhaps humans could try a different approach to solving this problem, and immediately several aliens turned to look at her with expressions that clearly showed they thought she was being ridiculous. The Sorok delegate hissed and asked what the primitive human species could possibly offer that the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy could not accomplish with all their superior technology and knowledge. And Jake felt his anger rising again, but he also felt something else growing inside him, which was determination to prove that humans were not as useless as these aliens believed. Jake stood up slowly and looked around the room at all the alien faces staring at him with doubt and barely hidden contempt, and he said in a clear voice that sometimes the old ways work when the new ones fail, and sometimes simple solutions are better than complicated ones that depend on everything working perfectly. The aliens looked confused by this statement, and Jake could see they did not understand what he meant, but Ambassador Grant nodded at him with approval, and within an hour the humans were preparing their rescue mission using ships that every other species in the galaxy would consider laughably outdated and primitive. The human rescue ships had thick metal hulls instead of exotic crystal or energy barriers, and they used chemical rockets instead of antimatter drives or space-folding engines, and all their controls could be operated by hand if the computer systems failed, and their navigation could be done by human pilots using their own skill and judgment. instead of relying on artificial intelligence that might be destroyed by electromagnetic pulses. Captain Roy Jenkins led the rescue mission, and he was an old pilot who had learned to fly in the early days of human space travel, when ships were much simpler and more likely to break down, and pilots had to know how to fix things themselves and keep flying even when half their systems stopped working. The alien species watched on their viewing screens as the primitive human ships flew straight toward the deadly pulsar where their own advanced vessels could not go, and Jake could see the doubt and worry on their faces as they realized that if the humans failed, then 300 Cathara scientists would die because no one else had any other ideas. The human ships disappeared into the electromagnetic field around the pulsar, and for long minutes there was no communication because the radiation blocked all signals, and the aliens waited in silence, wondering if they had just watched the humans fly to their deaths in a hopeless attempt to do something impossible. Then the ships appeared again on the viewing screens, and they were moving slowly but steadily away from the pulsar, and Captain Jenkins reported over the radio that all 300 Cathara scientists were safe aboard the human rescue vessels, and they were heading back to the space station. The alien delegates stared at the screens in shock and amazement because the primitive humans had succeeded, where the most advanced species in the galaxy had failed, and Jake felt a deep satisfaction as he watched their expressions change from doubt to surprise to something that might have been the beginning of respect. The rescue was complete and successful, and all the Cathara scientists were brought safely to the medical bay on Nexus Prime, and the human pilots were tired but proud of what they had accomplished, and Jake knew that something important had changed in how the aliens would think about humanity from now on. The celebration in the station's main plaza was quiet and strange, because while the aliens were grateful that the Cathara scientists had been saved, they seemed confused and almost embarrassed that the primitive humans had succeeded where their advanced technology had failed, and Jake Morrison walked through the crowd feeling both proud and frustrated that no one seemed to know what to say about what had happened. The plaza was a big open space in the center of the station with windows that showed the stars outside and plants from different worlds growing in special gardens, and beings from dozens of species stood around in small groups talking in low voices and glancing at the human delegation with expressions that Jake could not quite understand. He found himself standing near the fountain at the center of the plaza next to a man he had never seen before, who wore simple clothes that looked like they came from Earth and had gray hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he had seen many things in his life. And when the man turned to look at Jake, he smiled in a way that seemed familiar, even though they had never met. The stranger's name tag said Dan Phillips, independent contractor, and Jake wondered what kind of work an independent contractor would be doing on a diplomatic space station. But before he could ask, Don spoke first and said that Jake and his people had done good work during the rescue, and it reminded him of some stories his grandfather used to tell him when he was young. Jake asked what kind of stories, and Don smiled again with that same mysterious expression and said they were just old tales about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it mattered most, and that everyone knew how it was with legends because sometimes they were not as made up as people thought they were before. Jake could ask what Dan meant by that comment. The Zephyrian ambassador approached them, and its crystal body was shimmering with colors that Jake had learned meant the alien was confused or uncertain about something, and it asked Jake how the human species had managed to accomplish what none of the advanced civilizations could do with all their superior technology. Dan answered before Jake could speak, and he said that sometimes being behind was not the same thing as being inferior, and sometimes the old ways worked because they had been tested and proven over many years and were simple enough to keep working when everything else failed because they were too complicated. The Vorthan delegate joined their conversation, and its metallic face reflected the lights from the plaza, as it said that human legends only spoke about primitive strength and crude weapons, and it wanted to know how this related to advanced space rescue operations and technology. Dan looked thoughtful for a moment, and then asked the aliens what they really knew about human legends, and Jake could hear something in the older man's voice that suggested he was leading up to something important, but he was not sure what it might be. More aliens gathered around their small group as word spread that there was an interesting conversation happening, and Jake noticed that even species who had been openly mocking human stories the day before were now listening carefully to what Don had to say about legends and their meaning. The Cathara delegate, whose people had just been rescued, came over and asked Don to continue explaining what he meant about human legends, and Jake could see genuine curiosity in the alien's multiple eyes. Instead of the contempt that had been there during the cultural exchange meeting, Dan began speaking in a calm voice that somehow carried clearly through the noise of the plaza, and he said that the aliens seemed to think human legends were about strongmen and simple fighters, but they were missing the real point of what those stories meant, and Jake found himself leaning forward to listen, even though he thought he already knew human mythology pretty well. The older man gestured toward the window where they could see the human rescue ships docking with the station, and he said that when people heard about Hercules, they thought about superhuman strength and lifting heavy things, but strength was not just physical, and it was really about carrying burdens that other people could not bear and taking on impossible tasks. Not because you were stronger than everyone else, but because someone had to try, and you were willing to do it. Jake felt something click in his mind as he listened to Don explain the stories in a way he had never heard before, and he realized that maybe the legends were not just entertainment or primitive mythology, but something much deeper and more important. Dan continued talking about King Arthur and how people saw the sword in the stone and thought it was about magical weapons, but the real story was about taking responsibility when no one else would, and bringing together people who were fighting each other and giving them something worth working toward, and making the hard choices that leaders had to make even when those choices were painful. The aliens around them were listening with growing attention, and Jake could see their expressions changing as they began to understand that human legends might not be as simple and primitive as they had assumed, and that there might be deeper meanings hidden in stories they had dismissed as childish fantasies. Dan spoke about Odysseus and how he was not just a traveler with a long journey, but someone who never gave up no matter how impossible things looked, and who used his mind when his strength was not enough, and who kept trying to get home even when everything in the universe seemed to be trying to stop him. Jake watched the alien faces and saw that the mockery from yesterday was completely gone, and in its place was something that looked like respect and maybe even a little fear as they began to realize that human legends might be more dangerous than they had thought. Dan's voice grew stronger as he said that the alien species had spent so much time advancing their technology that they had forgotten something important, and the greatest strength was not in machines but in people, and in their willingness to keep trying when logic said they should quit, and in their ability to work together when everything fell apart, and in their refusal to abandon others even when it was dangerous to help. The plaza had grown quiet except for Dan's voice, and Jake realized that this stranger was teaching the most advanced species in the galaxy something they had never understood about humanity and about the real power that came from stories that had been passed down for thousands of years. The Sorok delegate stepped closer to their group, and its reptilian scales rippled with what Jake had learned was a sign of agitation or anger, and it hissed that these were still just stories and myths and not real achievements like their conquest of stellar phenomena or their mastery over quantum forces, and its voice carried the same decisive tone that had made Jake angry during the cultural exchange meeting. Dan looked at the Sorok with a smile that held secrets and asked if the legends were really just stories, and Jake could hear something in the older man's voice that suggested he was about to reveal something important that would change everything the aliens thought they knew about humanity. The crowd around them had grown larger, and beings from every species represented on the station were gathering to listen to this conversation, and Jake could see curiosity and doubt and worry on their faces as they tried to understand what this strange human was getting at with his questions about legends and their meaning. Dan looked around at all the alien faces staring at him, and his expression grew serious, and he said he wanted to tell them about something that had happened about 30 years ago, back when humanity was just figuring out faster than light travel, and they had built their first colony ship to carry people to establish humanity's first world beyond the solar system. The plaza had grown completely quiet, and even the background noise of the station seemed to fade away as Don began his story, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine because something about the older man's tone suggested that this was not going to be another mythology lesson, but something much more real and important. Dan said. The ship was called the New Hope, and it carried about 10,000 people who were going to start a new life on a planet many light years from Earth. But a navigation error had put them way off course, and their ship systems were failing, and they had no way to call for help because humanity barely had faster than light communication technology at that time. Jake found himself holding his breath as Dan continued and explained that the ship had ended up in orbit around a dying star that was about to go supernova, and they had maybe 6 hours before the radiation would kill everyone aboard, and there was no time to repair their engines or fix their navigation systems. The evacuation systems on the ship were damaged, and the escape pods could only hold about half the people, and someone would have to stay behind to manually launch the pods and make sure everyone else got away safely. And the ship's captain, whose name was Alex Turner, made the decision that he and his senior staff would stay behind so that the colonists could escape. Dan paused in his story, and Jake could see that every alien in the plaza was hanging on every word, and their expressions had changed from doubt to fascination to something that might have been fear as they began to realize that this was not a legend or a myth but actual human history. The older man continued and said that humans do not like leaving people behind, and when the evacuees found out that Captain Turner and his crew were planning to sacrifice themselves to save everyone else, they refused to go unless there was a way to save everyone, including the people who were staying behind to operate the ship. Dan explained that the colonists came up with what he called a crazy plan, and they stripped every piece of non-essential equipment from the ship and used whatever they could find to build a makeshift radiation shield. And they jury-rigged the engines to give them one last push toward the nearest habitable system, even though the chances of success were almost zero. Jake felt his heart pounding as he listened to this story he had never heard before, and he wondered why something so important and heroic was not taught in human schools or mentioned in history books. And he looked around at the alien faces and saw that they were beginning to understand something fundamental about humanity that they had missed before. Dan's voice grew softer but somehow more powerful as he described how Ken Turner and his crew stayed at their posts, manually keeping all the ship's systems running while the radiation levels climbed higher and higher, and they knew they were going to die, but they kept working because 10,000 lives depended on them not giving up. The story reached its climax when Dan said that they made it, and all 10,000 colonists survived and reached safety, but it took everything the crew had, and Captain Turner and his team died at their posts, keeping the ship running long enough to get their people home. And Jake felt tears in his eyes as he imagined those brave people sacrificing everything for others. The Zephyrian ambassador asked in a voice that sounded different from its usual crystalline tones whether this story was historical fact and not just another human legend, and Dan said simply that they could check the records because it was all documented and verified. And Jake realized that the aliens were about to learn something that would change their entire understanding of humanity. Dan looked around at the crowd of aliens and said that Captain Turner's first name was Alexander and his friends called him Alex, but he was descended from a long line of soldiers, and his great-great-grandfather had fought in something called World War II, and the family name was Turner, but the original family name way back in history was different. Jake felt his breath catch as understanding began to dawn, and he saw the same realization starting to appear on some of the alien faces as they began to connect the dots between this real historical event and the legends they had been discussing. Smile was quiet but profound as he revealed that the original family name was Turnus, which over time became Turner, and Alex Turner was a direct descendant of someone history remembered by a different name entirely, and someone that history books called Alexander. And Jake's mind reeled as he understood what the older man was saying. The revelation hit the assembled aliens like a physical blow when Don finished by saying that Alexander Turner was a direct descendant of Alexander the Great, and suddenly the human legends were not just stories anymore but compressed histories and cultural memories of real people whose descendants still walked among them and still carried the same courage and determination that had made their ancestors legendary. The silence in the plaza stretched for long moments as the aliens tried to process what Dan had just told them, and Jake could see shock and disbelief in growing understanding on their faces as they realized that human legends might not be primitive myths but actual compressed histories of real people and real events that had shaped humanity over thousands of years. Dan continued speaking, and his voice carried the weight of someone who understood things that others had missed, and he said that if the aliens wanted to know about human legends, they should understand that every single one of them was based on something real, and Hercules was not a myth, but probably a dozen different people whose stories got combined over time, and they were kings who united warring tribes and warriors who stood alone against impossible odds and leaders who carried burdens that should have broken them. Jake felt his understanding of his own species changing as Don explained that the legends were not just entertainment, but instruction manuals that taught every human child the values and behaviors that had kept humanity alive and growing stronger for thousands of years. And these stories told children that when things looked impossible, you kept trying, and when others were in danger, you helped them, and when someone had to make the hard choice, you stepped up. The older man gestured toward Jake and said that Commander Morrison's great-grandmother had been a medic in the European War and had saved hundreds of lives while under enemy fire, and before that his family line included explorers and pioneers and people who went into unknown places because someone had to do it, and the courage that made Jake stand up for humanity. In the council meeting was not learned behavior, but inherited memory. Jake stared at Don in amazement because he had never told anyone about his great-grandmother or his family history, but somehow this stranger knew details about his ancestry that even Jake himself had almost forgotten, and he wondered who Dan Phillips really was and how he could know so much about human bloodlines and family histories. The Vorthan delegate's metallic features shifted, and what Jake had learned indicated deep thought, and it asked if Don was saying that human legends were actually genealogical records and family histories disguised as mythological stories, and Don replied that they were more than that because they were instruction manuals that taught each generation how to behave when faced with impossible challenges. Dan explained that every human child grew up hearing these stories, and they learned that when things looked hopeless, you kept trying anyway, and that when others were in trouble, you helped them even if it was dangerous, and that when someone had to make the hard choice and sacrifice themselves for others, you stepped up and did what needed to be done. Ambassador Grant found her voice and asked who Don Phillips really was, because it was becoming clear that he was not just a random contractor who happened to be on the station, but someone with deep knowledge about human history and culture and bloodlines that went back thousands of years. Dan's smile was mysterious, and he said he was just someone who had been around long enough to see the patterns and to understand that the things aliens called legends were really just Tuesday for humanity. And this comment sent a ripple of shock through the alien crowd, because they were beginning to realize that what they considered impossible heroic deeds were normal everyday behavior for humans. The older man looked around at the alien faces that were no longer mocking but filled with a new understanding and fear, and he said that all the other species had advanced beyond their origins and evolved past their primitive ancestors and built perfect societies with perfect technology, but humans were different because they carried their entire history with them. Dan explained that every generation of humans passed down the stories of the ones who came before, and humans did not grow beyond their legends but grew because of them, and this was why humanity could succeed where more advanced species failed, because they had thousands of years of accumulated wisdom and courage and determination built into their cultural DNA. The Cathara delegate, whose people had been saved by human courage and determination, spoke quietly and said that the aliens owed humanity an apology, and more than that, they owed humans their respect because they had completely misunderstood what human legends represented and what kind of species they were dealing with. Dan shook his head and said that humans did not need apologies or special treatment, but maybe next time before the aliens dismissed someone's stories as primitive, they should ask themselves why those stories were still being told after thousands of years and why they had survived when so much else had been forgotten and lost. Jake watched as the crowd of aliens began to disperse, and he could see that everything had changed in how they looked at humanity, and he knew that the mocking and dismissive attitude from the cultural exchange meeting would never happen again because now they understood that human legends were not weaknesses, but strengths. As the plaza emptied, Don started to walk away and Jake caught his arm and asked who he really was because it was obvious that this was not just some random human who happened to know a lot about history and legends and family bloodlines that went back to ancient times. Dan's eyes sparkled with ancient wisdom and humor, and he said he was just a traveler and someone who had learned that the longest journeys were not through space, but through time, and the best companions for those journeys were the stories that reminded people who they were and where they came from. The older man walked away into the crowd, and Jake watched him go with the certainty that Don Phillips was more than he appeared to be, but then again, that was the point of the stories. Was it not? Because heroes rarely looked like what people expected, and they looked like ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. Jake realized that in a galaxy full of advanced civilizations, humanity's greatest advancement was not their technology but their refusal to forget where they came from and their determination to live up to the legends that had carried them this far through history. And the other species would learn in time that mocking human legends was like mocking the instruction manual for doing the impossible, and in a universe full of impossible things, that was a very dangerous mistake to make. Jake Morrison stood in the plaza watching Dan Phillips disappear into the crowd, and he felt like everything he thought he knew about humanity and their place in the galaxy had changed in the space of one conversation, and around him the alien delegates were talking in quiet voices about what they had just learned, and their tone was completely different from the mocking laughter of the day before. The next morning, Jake found himself in Ambassador Grant's office along with Dr. Ben Carter, and they were trying to understand what had happened and who Don Phillips really was, because when they checked the station records, there was no independent contractor by that name, and no one seemed to know how he had gotten aboard Nexus Prime or what kind of work he was supposed to be doing. Dr. Carter had spent the night researching the story about the new Hope Colony ship and Captain Alex Turner, and he confirmed that every detail Dan had shared was historically accurate and documented in human archives. But what was truly amazing was the genealogical information about Turner being descended from Alexander the Great, because that kind of detailed family history was almost impossible to trace back over thousands of years. Ambassador Grant said she had received messages from several alien species requesting formal meetings to discuss human culture and history, and the tone of these requests was respectful and even slightly fearful, which was a complete change from the dismissive attitude they had shown during the cultural exchange meeting. The Zephyrium Ambassador arrived first, and its crystal body was flickering with colors that Jake had learned indicated uncertainty and deep thought, and it asked if there were more humans like Dan Phillips who understood the true meaning of human legends, and whether humanity had been deliberately hiding their real capabilities from the galactic community. Jake found himself answering that Don was not hiding anything, because every human carried these stories and this knowledge, and the aliens had simply misunderstood what human legends represented and mistaken strength for primitivism and wisdom for simplicity. The Vorthan delegate came next, and its metallic features reflected the office lights as it asked whether human rescue operations always involved people willing to sacrifice themselves for others, and whether this was normal behavior for the species or something unusual that happened only during emergencies. Dr. Carter explained that self-sacrifice for the greater good was one of the core values taught by human legends, and that stories like those of Hercules and King Arthur and countless others all emphasize the importance of putting others before yourself and doing what was right even when it was dangerous or costly. More aliens requested meetings throughout the day, and Jake realized they were all trying to understand whether humanity was actually more dangerous than they had assumed, and whether the primitive appearance of human technology and culture was hiding something much more formidable. The Cathara delegate, whose people had been rescued, brought a formal gift of gratitude and asked if humans would be willing to share their methods of training people to remain calm and effective during emergencies, because Cathara society had never developed the same kind of cultural programming that made humans willing to risk everything for strangers. Jake found this request both flattering and slightly sad, because it meant the Cathara had advanced so far technologically that they had lost the basic social bonds that made people care about each other enough to take risks for the common good. Over the following weeks, Jake watched as human status in the galactic community changed dramatically, and species that had looked down on humanity as primitive newcomers were now approaching them with requests for cultural exchange and cooperation, and some were even asking if humans would be willing to teach their young people about courage and sacrifice. The most surprising development came when the Galactic Council officially requested that humanity take a leadership role in emergency response operations because their rescue of the Cathara scientists had demonstrated capabilities that none of the more advanced species possessed. Jake realized that what the aliens saw as primitive human technology was actually an advantage because human systems were designed to work even when everything went wrong, and human training emphasized adaptability and problem solving rather than reliance on perfect conditions and flawless equipment. Ambassador Grant was promoted to head of the new Emergency Response Division, and she asked Jake to serve as her deputy because his experience during the rescue operation and his understanding of human capabilities made him ideal for coordinating between human crews and alien populations. The cultural exchange meetings resumed, but with a completely different atmosphere, and now alien species were asking humans to explain their legends and stories instead of mocking them, and Jake could see genuine respect and curiosity in their questions. Dr. Carter became one of the most popular speakers in the galaxy as species after species requested lectures about human mythology and its practical applications, and he often mentioned Dan Phillips and the conversation in the plaza that had changed everything, but no one ever saw the mysterious contractor again. Jake sometimes wondered if Dan had been real or some kind of manifestation of human collective memory, but he decided it did not matter because the important thing was that humanity had found its place in the galactic community, not by becoming more like the other species, but by showing them the value of staying true to their own nature. The legends that had once been mocked as primitive stories were now studied by alien scholars as examples of practical wisdom and psychological conditioning, and Jake felt proud that humanity's greatest strength had turned out to be their refusal to abandon the values and stories that had carried them from caves to spaceships. Years later, when Jake had become commander of the Emergency Response Division, he would sometimes tell new recruits the story of Don Phillips and the day humanity proved that their legends were not just stories, but instruction manuals for doing the impossible, and he would remind them that being human meant carrying the courage of every hero who had come before them. The galaxy had learned that mocking human legends was dangerous, not because humans would get angry, but because those legends represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about how to succeed when success seemed impossible and how to keep going when everyone else had given up. Jake knew that humanity would face many more challenges in the years to come, but he was confident they would meet them the same way they always had, with courage and determination and the knowledge that somewhere in their past, someone else had faced something just as difficult and found a way to win.